Hello, everybody. My name is Jennifer Schmidt. Welcome to this Gallery Teachers Master's class on tapping into students' prior knowledge. All right, so let's start off with our workshop agenda. Today, we're going to cover topics such as constructivism. We'll talk a little bit about what we know. We'll connect new information to prior knowledge. We'll talk about engaging the mind to create prior knowledge. We'll discuss what advanced organizers are, and we'll talk about producing strong connections or strong schema to information. Let's watch this short video about schema.
Most of the factors that predict whether or not something that is being perceived will also be remembered operate in the first few seconds of learning. One of these factors involves something termed a schema and whether or not the new learning bumps into one. Let me show you an example of a schema by having Dr. Whitehead and myself read a paragraph to you, one actually taken from a famous research paper. Your job is to remember as many facts about the paragraph as you can. Let me tell you in advance that you are going to fail miserably at this task unless I do something first. I can instantly improve your memory score from between 50 to 100% simply by adding 7 little words before you hear Dr. Whitehead and myself. But I'm not going to do that. You will hear the paragraph first, then I will read you the words.
The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient, depending on how much there is to do.
If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. It is important not to overdo things. That is, it is better to do too few things at once than too many.
In the short run, this might not seem important, but complications can easily arise. A mistake can be expensive as well.
After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into different groups again. Then they can be put into their appropriate places.
Eventually, they'll be used once more in the whole cycle or have to be repeated. However, that is a part of life.
Did you get all that? No? Let us give you now the 7 magic little words. This paragraph is all about washing clothes. What that sentence provides for you is a mental framework, a way of organizing thoughts around some aspect of the world. We call such frameworks schemas, and you have them about people, situations, objects. This means something profound. Prior knowledge can disturbingly shape how you memorize and retain for long-term storage future knowledge. If a schema is triggered near the moment of learning, that learning is more permanent.
Brainers!
Now, could you follow what they were talking about? In the beginning, it was somewhat difficult because we didn't know the theme. We didn't know what they were talking about. They didn't activate our prior knowledge. They just started talking about the topic. This can happen many times with our students when we go directly into the book and we tell our students, open up to page 15, and we get going on the material. It really can be very beneficial to our students to activate prior knowledge, to give them an idea of where we're going. The most important single factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows. This was stated by David Ausubel, a cognitive theorist, and we're going to see more about him later when we talk about advanced organizers. So we could say, it sounds pretty simple, right? I just need to activate the prior knowledge of my students and get going. But it's not that simple. Let's talk a little bit about constructivism so we can build a foundation before we go into how we can help our students with their prior knowledge. Let's talk a little bit about cognitive constructivism. Piaget was a theorist, a cognitive theorist, who believed that we were all born with natural reflexes that he called innate schemas, so that we're not born like a blank slate. He believed that there were some innate schemas in our mind, some innate information that's already in there that we can build upon. For example, you don't have to teach a baby how to grasp a finger. The baby already knows how to do that. So that means there must be something already innate within our minds that we can then build upon. So the idea of constructivism is just that. We have information and we build upon it little by little. Another theorist, Lev Vygotsky, had another very important theory called the zone of proximal development. And another part of the zone of proximal development, which was related to giving challenges to people, was the idea of the more knowledgeable other. And this is very, very important when we talk about schema and prior knowledge, because sometimes when we're learning something new, we might need some help from someone else to guide us, to check if information is correct, to ask questions, to find out if we're going the right direction, someone to guide us. So this is a very important part of constructing good, strong schema. We'll talk a little bit more about schema later. Another theorist, John Dewey, said, okay, that's important. We need to activate prior knowledge. But I think it's even more important that we provide students with experiences, because that's really the way that we can build and construct upon what we already know. By giving them new experiences and bringing in different senses, we can make the prior knowledge and the schema in the mind even stronger. So let's just talk a little bit about this word schema that I'm using. It's kind of like having the mind as a library. Okay, we're going to use an analogy here. Let's pretend that schema is information that comes into the brain, and then we put it into folders. Okay, and each folder is filed in our minds. So we have like this library of information going on in our minds. Now we know we don't actually have these folders. We know through neuroscience, it's more neurosynapses. It's based on chemicals and proteins in the brain, and that information is retrieved from different areas of our brains. But for the purposes here, let's just say it's kind of like folders being created in the brain. Okay, so let's just talk quickly about the idea behind prior knowledge and schema. So the idea is that when a child is born, let's say you have a dog in your family, and you teach the child, okay, a dog has 4 legs, it has fur, it barks, it's not a person, it's an animal. Okay, so the child creates this folder in the mind of what a dog is. And then let's say one day you go to the park and you come across a cat. And the child looks at it and says, okay, 4 legs, fur, it's an animal, it's not a person, must be a dog. Because the child has that dog folder in the mind. Let's call it a folder of these neural connections. And it's up to the parent or the more knowledgeable other or the caregiver to say, no, honey, that's not a dog, that's a cat. Dogs go bark, 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 cats go meow. So what happens in the brain is, I can't put that information into my dog folder, okay? I have to create a new folder for cats. They're all under animals, but they're not the same. So this process is called assimilation or accommodation. And assimilation is if I see another dog, another type of dog, a big dog, a small dog, a different color dog, that goes into the dog folders. But once I see another 4-legged animal and it's not a dog, a horse, or a cat, I have to create a new folder. That's called accommodation. So this is a very important thing to think about when we're teaching our students. Am I giving them information that's assimilation? They already know this and I'm just adding more. Or am I kind of adding a new folder and we're kind of branching off? And do I need to help them accommodate? And it has to be strong if I'm going to accommodate. I have to give them a lot of information to make that happen. So do you remember something like this from your childhood? I think in most countries, people do something like this. They go through the different animal sounds with the kids to differentiate what a dog is, what a frog is, what a cat is. And really what we're doing is we're helping the kids build strong schema. So how does schema affect learning? Well, it's very involved in our attention, efficiency, to simplify things, interpret information. But there's one thing, it's not so easy to change. So you can imagine once ideas start going into the brain, and neuroscience tells us about this, that once you start having a thought or thinking something over and over, that neural pathway becomes very strong. So it can be a little bit difficult to change once we start building that schema. Wadworth suggests that schema or schemata be thought of index cards filed in the brain, each one telling an individual how to react to incoming stimuli or information. So this is very important. We're going to see a little bit more about this, how also sometimes misinformation in our schema can cause us problems. Okay, so it seems simple, right? We know that the brain acts like in this way of creating these folders, and that we just need to activate the prior knowledge and help the students assimilate or accommodate. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. So we need to also know, where does the schema come from? Where does this prior knowledge come from? And does everyone have the same schema? So just taking a look at this image, we can see that it's pretty complex. They're all different parts of the brain, and they all have different ways of working. And so when information comes into the brain, it doesn't just go to one folder or one place, okay? It's actually, we're attaching information to different parts of the brain. So this is why it's very important when we teach in a multimodal input fashion, meaning that we do things for sight, for hearing, kinesthetic. We look at different websites, videos, we do experiments, because that information goes to different parts of the brain. And so the schema isn't just stored in one part. The information is stored in different parts of the brain. So that's why we want to work to make the schema strong. So this is what we just said about multimodal input. This just gives you a couple of extra visuals that you can take a look at about where worries go, remembering things, regret, language, memory, goes to different parts of the brain. So what this tells us is it's very important that we do create multimodal input with our students and give them different ways to help them store information. Another thing that's very important to think about when we talk about schema and prior knowledge is worldview. Now, this also comes from growth mindset and other areas. But when we say, does everyone have the same schema? We know that they don't, okay? It depends on where you live, what time of life you're living, what your beliefs are, if you follow a religion, what society you live in, what are the values of your family or your society, what is your economic background, and what is your knowledge. And when we say knowledge, it means all of the experiences that you have had in your life. Everything that has gone into your mind, books that you've read, things that have happened, movies that you have watched, places that you have gone, all of this creates our schema. So I just want to give you a little example of an advanced organizer. We're going to talk about this more later, but where some misinformation or some problems in our schema can cause us problems with learning, or make it very difficult to build and create a good foundation if we're building on wrong information. So let me use this example. When I teach teachers or I do things with science and related to ecosystems, I start off with this image, and it's a bee that's trapped inside a house. And I ask people, what should you do if you have a bee trapped inside of your house? An alarming number of people will say, kill it. You have to kill the bee. And then I ask them, well, are you allergic to bees? Will you go into anaphylactic shock? And many of them say no. So then I say, well, why do you need to kill the bee? Well, that's what my parents taught me, or that's what someone else taught me that I was supposed to do. So then we go through a little talk and we talk about what bees actually do with pollination and what how pollination works, and that this can help to grow food and all of these kinds of things. So we adjust that misinformation before we start the unit and recognize that every animal, plant, being in our ecosystem serves a purpose. So this is a very important thing, because if I go into a unit on ecosystems and that idea is not correct in the mind of our students, I'm going to be building on top of wrong information. So this is why it's very important to check prior knowledge before we try to build upon it. Might my students have any incorrect information, biases, myths, stereotypes, assumptions, fact versus opinion, an under or overestimation of something, something could be used for, the possibilities of something, pros and cons, or possible dangers or benefits? And also, are there any cultural aspects I need to take into consideration? Okay, so there are a couple of other issues we want to think about. If prior knowledge is insufficient, students might not be able to acquire new knowledge. If prior knowledge is inappropriate, it can distort new learning. And if prior knowledge is inaccurate, they might not be able to acquire new knowledge. So this is where we can see it's a little bit more complex. I have to think about what my students already know. Is there any misinformation? Are there any cultural aspects that I need to take into consideration? Because I don't want to build on top of things that could be problematic. Some other things we have to think about, and I'm not going to go too deeply into this, are things called cognitive distortions. And there are quite a number of these. And sometimes our brains can lie to us. And this is really because the brain is trying to be efficient. The brain is an efficient machine, and it likes to go and do things very quickly. So sometimes we can overgeneralize, we can have black and white thinking, but this can really hurt us when we're trying to learn something new if we're using these cognitive distortions. So something important to think about from neuroscience and studies going on, it tells us that the brain is a great predictor. And sometimes we make a lot of predictions based on past experiences. But what happens if we had a bad experience that created a neural pathway in our brains that we now think we cannot do, or we're not good at, or that we have to avoid? That can also cause us a lot of problems when we're trying to build on what we already know, what we already think. So through these studies, they say that our brains, parts of our brains are still working like in times of cavemen, and that our brains are all about survival. And sometimes this can work against us because maybe we're not thinking rationally, and we might be building upon fears that we have. Now, Daniel Kahneman also studied this and wrote a whole book on fast and slow thinking. And he talks about another analogy that we have two systems in the brain. System 1 is fast thinking and system 2 is slow thinking. And in the fast thinking system, it's highly unconscious and it's very error prone. But if we think about it, it's very useful to us, because if we're driving a car and a rock or something flies out in front of us, we have to think fast to get away from the rock. But it can be very error prone in other ways, so that if we see someone that has a certain aspect about them, we might jump to conclusions about them. And that can be very hurtful to us. So what he says is that there's another system which is called slow thinking. This is more reliable. It's slower. It's more for complex decisions. It's more effortful, but it's more reliable. So many times when we activate prior knowledge with our students, we want to try to move into system 2 whenever possible and adjust the system 1 misinformation. Another thing that we can take a look at is fixed mindset versus growth mindset. So when we say, okay, I'm going to start teaching my students something new, we also have to take into consideration if they have a fixed mindset in an area. A fixed mindset is basically something that is built within a person because of possibly bad experiences in life. Let's give the example. Let's say one day when I was a child, I was singing with my family, and somebody said, "Whoa, gosh, you're really off key here, And I thought, oh my gosh, I shouldn't sing because my family told me that's not my talent. I shouldn't do that. So it puts me into a fixed mindset, believing that I can't get better at singing. And even sometimes families will say things like, nobody in our family has the ability to sing. Everybody has a bad voice. That can also create a fixed mindset. Well, my family just doesn't have this talent, so I shouldn't even try. So many times when you're in class and you say, okay, well, I'm going to bring up prior knowledge about math or history or English, do they have a fixed mindset in that area? Do they think, I'm not good at math, I'm not good at English, I'm not good at languages, I'm not good at art? Okay, that's another issue we're dealing with. So we want to try to move students into more of a growth mindset and say, okay, I had a bad experience in English or math one time, but I'm not going to let that stop me. I'm not good at it yet. So that's another thing we have to work with when we're dealing with prior knowledge. All right, so it's very important that we build strong schema when we're working with our students, and we're going to see some ways that we can do this. So one of the things we have to think about, when I just told you before about this fixed mindset where someone might say that I'm not good at something or they had a bad experience, neuroscience tells us that the brain is like plastic and that it can change. So if students have built these neural pathways, I'm not good at something, I can't do something, misconceptions, misinformation, we can work to change that. It's just not fast. Neuroplasticity and neuroscience tells us the concept of use it or lose it. So if students are constantly telling themselves, I'm not good at something, or I don't have this information, or something like this, what we have to do is create a new neural pathway through new experiences, hobbies, habits, and repetition. We're going to see why that's important later. So another thing that's really important is that the teacher works as a role model. This really helps us. As we saw before when I talked about Vygotsky and the more knowledgeable other, the teacher can help students develop strong schema. So when students have questions or misinformation, or they need help while they're learning something new, the teacher can help them build this strong schema. So let's discuss some ways to build this better schema, use prior knowledge, use a little bit of prediction, work on that worldview, work on cognitive distortions, create stronger connections, and create experiences. We're going to start by talking about something called an advanced organizer. An advanced organizer, which I told you near the beginning with that quote from David Ausubel, is a way that before we start a unit, we engage the learner, we activate prior knowledge, we ask questions and involve students, maybe even have them think in pairs. We review some old concepts and introduce some new ones. We correct misconceptions and open the mind to new possibilities. We create prior knowledge and background, and then we introduce a driving question. Let me give you an example of an advanced organizer. So let's say I have a unit on the solar system. And we've studied the solar system before, and we're going to do something a little bit more complex now. And I want to activate the students' prior knowledge. I don't want to go directly into the book and say, everybody open up to page 15, we're going into the solar system. I want to lower the fear in my students. I want them to feel they have something to talk about. And then I'm also going to deal with a couple of maybe misinformation that they might have in their minds that I don't want to build upon, because we've been learning about the solar system for many years, but I know there's something they probably don't have a good grasp on. So I start by asking them about who this character is, what his job is, what does he do, where does he go. We start introducing some of our main vocabulary, which would be things like space, the planet, sun, moon, universe, Milky Way, oxygen, gravity, spacesuit, shuttle, missions, all of these kinds of words, as much as we can. Some of it's prior knowledge, and some of it might be some new words. And then I'm going to review some words the kids might know, but maybe they don't. And I want to also check if they have some misinformation. I find that a lot of them have trouble with these ideas of what is rotate and what is revolve and what goes around what. So before I even go into the unit, I've already grabbed their attention with Buzz Lightyears. We've talked about it. We've lowered the fear a little bit. The students are interested. Now I'm going to use this moment to adjust something that we probably have to fix before we move on. So we're going to take this moment and talk about, okay, let's say Buzz is in space and we're talking about the sun, the earth, and the moon. Let's find out a little bit about how these things work with each other, how they interact, even though they're not very close together. And so we would go through a little talk about rotate versus revolve. And I can even have the kids stand up and physically spin around each other and things like that. Afterwards, I would also bring in writing, because neuroscience tells us we really should go back to writing things down. This is very beneficial to the brain. So I would have the kids draw some pictures to make it even stronger in their brains. And then eventually we start building upon this prior knowledge. Then I finish my advanced organizer with a driving question. Even though many objects in space have a great distance between them, how do these objects interact? So I've started off my unit before I've even gone into my unit. I've lowered the fear, I've engaged the students, I've activated prior knowledge, I've included some new words, I've adjusted some possible misinformation. And then the most important thing that we're going to get out of this unit is understanding that things in space are a great distance, but they always interact. Some other ways that you can use advanced organizers to engage your students and activate prior knowledge is to use something that they know from real life, something that they find intriguing. So, of course, Harry Potter is a great one. villains, or are they? We could use this for a unit talking about villains, or talking about the way the way we see people. Can you judge a book by its cover? Okay. Another one would be if we're teaching a course in math. Is there math in art and architecture all around us? A lot of times when math teachers teach, they teach a lot of formulas and things like this, but it's very important for students to have a connection to something real and something that they already know. So we can use real things around us, such as art and architecture, to connect to new math concepts. There's another website that we can use, and it's called the Humans of New York. And if you go on this website, you will see different images of people that live in New York. And what you could do is show your students a picture of someone and ask them, what do you think about this person? What job do they have? What is their life? All of these kinds of things. Now, we might find that some stereotypes come out, some misinformation, possibly some cultural misinformation. And this is a good moment that we can show our students that sometimes what we think isn't as it always is. We can't really judge a person just by looking at them. Another way that we can activate prior knowledge is by using things that kids like, for example, video games. And we can find out what kinds of components do these video games have that kids really like. You might find that a lot of video games are inspired by famous artists, and they have very important artworks in the background. They have cities, they have different design eras such as Art Nouveau and Art Deco. And it's a great way to connect to students' prior knowledge. Another way that we can do this is by using something abstract. And I find that this one works really, really well. So let's say, I know this, I have a unit on perspectives, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by showing a video clip to my students before I even tell them what we're going to be studying. You can find many of these videos on YouTube, and they are people who are colorblind that get a gift of these glasses that help them see color for the first time. And it's amazing because many of these people start crying when they see color. Now, you better believe people are going to remember these videos because they're very impactful. So I can then start talking to the students. Well, can't everyone see color, right? Doesn't everyone have this ability? What are other things that we might not see the same or might not have the same experience in life? And this is a really great way to engage the mind, but I'm also creating their prior knowledge, because as we move through the unit, I can keep referring back to that video that we saw on YouTube, and you can be sure they're going to remember this video. Okay, another thing I'd like to talk to you about now is how to create strong schema. Once we've activated it, once we've got the prior knowledge up, we've adjusted misinformation, we're thinking about worldview, possibly adjusting our fixed mindset to a growth mindset. Okay, maybe I'm not good at this yet, but I'm willing to try. We've lowered the fear. Okay, after we start a good foundation, like I said with Buzz Lightyear's, and we adjust the ideas of the rotate and revolve, now I need to build upon this because I've got the idea, I've got them started, now I need to build strong schema. Well, what I'd like to talk to you about is something called the spiral curriculum. Jerome Bruner speaks about this, and Jerome Bruner is a cognitive psychologist, but also you can watch this TED Talks if you'd like from Kristen Phillips. This is a lady who is a school principal, and she goes through a TED Talk where she starts off by speaking about how every year, twice per year, she's got to adjust her time in her radio in her car. And she thinks every year, okay, I know the buttons, I know what I have to push, I know what I have to turn. I'll be able to do it next time we have to change the clocks. Sure enough, the next time comes around to change the clocks, and she's starting from zero. I don't remember what buttons I have to push. I don't remember what knobs I have to turn. And she says, why is this? Like, I do this 2 times every year. Why can't I remember this? Well, the brain has this, what neuroscience tells us is use it or lose it. So if you don't continually use something, the brain says, I don't really need that information. And the brain is very efficient. So it will just cut those neural synapses away and say, I don't really need to keep this in my mind. So what ends up happening is through the TED Talks, Kristen is talking and she says, you know what? Every year the kids fail the part of the math exam on fractions. And she was talking to the math teachers like, well, what's going on here? Why can't these kids get fractions? And then when she looked at the curriculum, she realized the kids only see fractions, maybe one unit in one book for a very short period of time. And she said, like, how is this possible? So what she realized was if the kids don't revisit something, the brain is doing that same thing, use it or lose it. So this means that when we teach kids things that we want them to keep in their minds and long-term memory, we have to continually build upon it and use it at different levels of complexity. Some ways we can do that is by using something like Webb's depth of knowledge, where first we recall information, then we build skills and concepts, then we might use some strategic thinking, and then we can use something like extended thinking, where we have to use more complex reasoning and problem solving. We can also use Bloom's taxonomy, which is lower order thinking and higher order thinking. In lower order thinking or foundational knowledge, we have knowledge, understand, and apply. And then in higher order thinking, we have analyzing, evaluating, and creating. So this is another thing that we can do when we teach kids new concepts of vocabulary. We can go through different steps where we first have them understand it, then we work on applying the information. Later on, we can use it to analyze something. We can evaluate and we can create. What we can also do is that not that we have to go back and reteach something, but we can take parts of things we've already taught from prior units and include them in our current unit. Another thing we want to think about is multimodal input and output, as we talked about earlier. So this means that when we're teaching our students, we want to try to make sure that we're giving them the information from a visual, auditory, from reading and writing, kinesthetic. We want to use different websites, experiments, give them new experiences, so that we're creating multiple forms of connections to the information in our brains. Another thing that we can use is design thinking. Design thinking goes through a different number of stages that builds complexity at each stage. First, we start by empathizing. We then define a possible problem or if we have limitations. We then ideate on how we could brainstorm and create ideas to solve the problems. We prototype, we come up with a new product or a plan, and then we test it out. Let me just give you a quick idea on a unit construction and sequence of how we could use the advanced organizer to activate prior knowledge, and then how it would build complexity upon that information. So let's say I have a unit on art, and it's called What is Art? And it's going to be related to promoting local artists. So I know my students probably have some misinformation. They probably think that all artists are born with talent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by asking them, is it true that all artists are born with some sort of innate talent? And ask them true or false. Then afterwards, I'm going to play a little clip. There's a real clip, a video clip of Ed Sheeran on a talk show. I would just play the audio. And you hear Ed Sheeran singing horribly off key when he was a teenager. And he says, you know, a lot of people ask me if I was born with my talent. And he says, you know what? I had to work really hard to hone my craft. And so this can then adjust that information in the students. Then we can start talking about things that we would like to do, talents that we don't think we were born with, but things that we would like to develop and how we think we could develop them. Then we'll talk a little bit about local artists. And does everyone who's an artist have to work only in that area, or can they have other jobs? After we do this, we will go on to building the complexity on this topic. And then what we'll do is we'll go into the first section of a unit, what is art, and we'll do a descriptive task where I get the students learning about different types of art and coming back and teaching the class. Then we'll go into combined arts where I'll do a creative thinking task, where I'll teach students about putting two different types of art forms together, such as dancing and painting, and then have them come up with their own combined art. Third, we'll go into the part of the unit what goes into being an artist. And we'll have them do some critical thinking and interview some local artists. And then the last part is promotion, going through the design thinking phases and having students think about a possible project that they could work on to help promote these local artists. Another thing that is really important to help build strong schema is to reflect upon our learning. Neuroscience tells us this is a very, very important thing. So what this means and what we want to do when we talk about reflection is after we do the learning, and we do a unit, let's say it's on artists and promoting artists, we want to reflect on what we learned. What went well? What could we have done better? What did we learn about local artists? Let's review even some of the new language that we learned. This really helps to create stronger schema. So let's just review what we learned in this masterclass. We've covered how complex the brain is in relation to stored information. We looked at some ways to engage our students, activate prior knowledge, and involve our students in the discussion. We've seen the importance of revisiting topics with increasing complexity and variation, and we see how important it is to reflect on our learning. Here are some classroom activities that you can do with your students. Think about the next unit that you will teach that you think is difficult for your students or that they might have some misinformation. Think about how you would create an advanced organizer that would engage your students, activate prior knowledge, address some misinformation, work to lower fear by showing students a new perspective or giving them a task where they gain confidence and build new schema. How would you build on this new information or schema by using it at varying degrees of complexity? And how would you include activities that offer new experiences that require different senses to interact with the content? And lastly, how would you reflect on the learning? For more useful websites and ELT resources, be sure to check out the Gallery Teachers Workshop Library, where you will get lots of information to help you with your teaching needs.